Good morning. Welcome to church. If you're new here, my name is Seth. I'm one of the pastors here at The Well. Quick poll to get us started this morning. How many of you have ever, at any point in your life, had parents? Okay, a few of you are liars. Now that we've got that out of the way. I was thinking recently about, you know how when you're a kid and you're growing up, regardless of whether your parents were awful or if you had the best parents in the world, you kind of get to a point where you start thinking, you're like, I don't even know if I want kids, but if I do, I know what I'm going to do different, right? And you start to plot that kind of stuff out. And so I remember thinking about all the different things that I would do as a parent and what sort of parent I would be. And so before Felicity, our oldest daughter, before her, Katie and I, we would discuss what kind of parents we were going to be, what kind of rules there would be in our home, how we would approach certain things. Hindsight, I think that we actually came up with more rules for ourselves than we did for kids because, let's be honest, our experience to that point was parents, not children. And so we're like, I know how the parents could be better. And so we came up with all these rules for ourselves. So as an example, we determined that anytime our kids would ask the question, why, we would give them an answer. Because there would be in my house no because I said so. Because when I was a kid, I hated because I said so. I had a very inquisitive little mind. I wanted to know everything. And so I would ask why a lot, and I'd get because I said so. And I'm like, I wouldn't have asked you the question if I just wanted you to say because I said so. I want to understand why. So I decided that that was going to be the rule in our house, is that we would always answer why. Is anybody curious how that's gone to this point? I am happy to report that I have perfectly followed all of my own rules. Because as a parent, you can change the rules whenever you want. And so I can move the finish line, and it's really convenient, honestly. Because here's the thing, at some point you realize that your child's not asking why because they want to know anything. They're asking why because they think it's funny. And there is something ingrained in the human nature that when that why is asked for the millionth time, there is something inside of you that explodes and says, because I said so. Why can you not just acknowledge that I am your father and I know more than you do? You're 3, okay? Because I said so. It just happens. And so now that law in my household has been abolished. The finish line has been moved, and we'll try again with a new finish line somewhere else. And this is kind of what we're talking about in the scriptures today. If you haven't figured it out yet, we're in Matthew chapter 5. Probably could have guessed that by now. But Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, and here's what Jesus says. He says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. This is a way to refer to the whole of the Old Testament, okay? So don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, let's set the stage here some, okay? Has anyone in here ever read through the Old Testament and been a little bit confused by the laws? Yeah. We still have some liars in here. Interesting. I'm on to you guys. Now, has anyone in here maybe you started your Bible in a year this year and you got to Leviticus and you gave up? Don't raise your hand for that, okay? But we know who you are, okay? We know who gives up when they get to Leviticus, and it's most of us. It's the vast majority of us. And that's actually normal because the reality is that the law is not as easy as do this, don't do that. That's what we want it to be. We want black and white, but it's not black and white. It's not as easy as just do this, don't do that. We want the law to just be something I can check the list and I can be certain that I'm doing the thing right and I'm good. I've got the right boxes checked. I have the wrong boxes left blank. We're good to go. But it's not written like that. The law was written assuming the people who were reading it we're living in a particular time in a particular place. So let me give you a little bit of an example of how this works. Leviticus chapter 19:19. All of you have this memorized, right? Leviticus 19:19. Do not plant your fields with 2 kinds of seed. It's our favorite law, right? We all meditate on that one. Think about it often. We know there's laws like this in Leviticus. Laws like don't use 2 different kinds of fabric in your clothing and things like this. And we get confused about these kind of laws, and this is why we give up, right? And so here's the thing. So this says, do not plant two kinds of seeds in your fields. My wife is currently planting a garden in our front yard, okay? And some of you are like, the front yard? Why not the backyard? Children. There you go, children. So we have a lawn, our front yard is no longer a lawn, but it's now a garden. And I don't know what all she's planting out there, but what I do know is that my wife is the master of chaos. I've labeled her as a chaos gardener. And I was actually talking with a friend about it the other day, and he's like, what does that mean? And I took a picture of our front lawn and sent it to him. And he was like, oh, okay. So there's like 4 different trees planted out there. There's like this big trellis for something. And I'm pretty sure when she was sowing seeds, she mixed them all up in a bucket or something and then was just like skipping and throwing them. I think that's what happened. And so here's the thing. Here's the thing though. None of us are going around looking for people who are planting 2 different kinds of seeds and calling them out as covenant breakers. We're not like driving by like, oh, those pagans are at it again. Darn Philistines, man. They just keep planting 2 kinds of seeds, right? We don't do that. Why? Because even if we if we're not in a place to wrap our minds around the law fully, there's something in us that still understands that these laws were written to a particular people in a particular place at a particular time. We still get that to some degree, right? And that's why we have to further unpack this a little bit, though. Now, Dan Kimball, he's got this book called How Not to Read the Bible. It's a great book, actually. You're welcome to read it. But in his book, How Not to Read the Bible, he actually breaks down this passage. And he talks about how the pagan nations, the nations around Israel that worshiped other gods, they would intentionally plant different seeds in the same field as an offering to the fertility gods and goddesses. So they'd plant these different kinds of seeds together, hoping that it would yield a more abundant harvest. And God of Israel is saying, not you. Not going to work that way for you. Because when people see your fields bringing an abundant harvest, they're going to look and say, but you didn't do the thing, so how is your field abundant? Yahweh. It has to be their God. And so we can know that this is still kind of how we can unpack these laws today, right? So here's what happens. During the time that Jesus was giving this message, there were these people called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees would have looked at laws like this law, and they would have understood that God created this law so that Israel, his covenant people, would avoid the practices of the pagan nations around them. So that when God did provide the harvest, it was clear who provided the harvest. And so they would have known that, and yet they also simultaneously would have been asking, what's the modern application? Do you see what I'm saying? And so maybe we're planting 2 different kinds of seeds in the field together, but is there an application to which we can say, I want to make sure that if I have any success in this life, that people know that it was God's favor. It's not because I played into the system. It's not because I sold my soul. It's not because of any other reason. It's because of God's favor. And so we see how the Old Testament law still actually has some relevance in our lives. And so during this time when Jesus was speaking, you had a couple different groups of people. You had the types of people who were hyper-Torah observers. And Torah just means law, okay? So this is all the Old Testament laws you can think of. That's what we're talking about. And you had these people who were hyper-Torah observers. They were doing everything they could to, as rigidly as possible, follow these laws. And at the same time, you had some people who looked at the law and thought, well, we'll keep the moral parts, but I'm still going to go hang with my friends at the Colosseum. And circumcision, is it necessary? I feel like we can just kind of skip that part, right? You're uncomfortable, but you get it, right? And here's the thing. We are living in this same kind of reality today. We have Christians who interpret the laws so loosely that there's no way to even know if they're following Jesus or not. There's no way to identify whether they're a Christian. And then we have those who are so rigid and so legalistic on the laws that we wonder if they've ever loved anyone or anything in their life, right? We have both sides. But then these people see Jesus coming onto the scene, and they're seeing that his interpretation seems to be so incredibly different than that of the Pharisees. There's something unique about the way that Jesus reads his Bible compared to the religious elite. And so what do we do with that? And what's interesting about this passage is that we can almost imagine it as sort of a conversation, because Jesus is really good at, when he's talking to people, knowing what the objections are gonna be. Have you ever listened to somebody that when they talk, you're thinking, oh, I gotta ask this question, and then like 2 minutes later they address it and you're like, oh, okay, I got the answer, right? It's kind of how Jesus talks. He's saying things and you have questions, but then he addresses the answer. So if we kind of put this in our minds as if it's a conversation, I think it helps us to unwrap this a little bit better. So you can almost imagine somebody in the audience who would have heard Jesus say this, and then they would say, now, Jesus, I've heard that there are some people saying that you're kind of loose with the Sabbath. So are you really here to honor the Torah and the prophets? I feel like I've heard different. To which Jesus responds in Matthew 5:18. He says, truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. And so we can hear that and we can say, okay, perfect. So Jesus is respecting the law. Jesus sees the Old Testament and he has some sort of respect for it at least. And he gives this example of how secure this is actually. He does something that the psalmist would do all the time, where to show just how secure God's law is, God's word is, God's command is, however you want to phrase it, but the anything coming out of the mouth of God, just how secure that is, they would put it up against something that we know is secure. That's the world that we live on. Has anybody here ever lived a day where the sun didn't rise? Right? We just know it happens. Every day, without fail, the sun rises. Every day, without fail, the sun sets. And there is nothing you can do to stop it. In fact, there's nothing you can do to make it happen. It is fully out of your control, and yet it is so reliable. For centuries, it has been reliable. And the psalmists would look at that and say, you know how reliable that is? The Word of God is so much more secure and reliable than that. And that's what Jesus is pulling on. He's saying heaven and earth passing away, like nobody's seen that happen. You're not going to see the law vanish either. It's here, it's secure. My word remains. And so Jesus has now told us that he's come to fulfill the law, and everything will be accomplished that's in the law and the prophets. So he's not like me, a parent abolishing laws and moving the finish line and trying to figure things out on the fly, right? Like anybody in here who's a parent realizes that every single day you have a new understanding of what it means to be a parent, right? Like every single day your kids throw something new at you and you've got to come up with something new. And you're just figuring this out as you go. That's not Jesus. Jesus has already seen the finish line. He knows what's going to happen. And so he's able to perfectly step into this law. And so Jesus is actually respecting the laws in a way that brings clarity. It's kind of like all along, we've had just this to follow. We've got an image here. Anybody know what song this is? I did see a hand raised, but I'm not going to let you answer it yet, okay? Now, if you can read music, you might be able to figure it out, right? But then it's as if Jesus comes on the scene, he sits down at the piano, he starts to hit the keys. You hear this? It's good, thank you, tech team. And all of the sudden, we're like, oh, that's what it was. We've been reading the law, and we sit and we look, don't plant two kinds of seeds, and we're like, God, I don't even know what to do with this. And then Jesus comes in and he lives out the law perfectly, and it's this moment that suddenly it comes to life in a new way for us. It's as if we've taken a two-dimensional picture off of a page and it's become three-dimensional. It's become something in our reality that we can interact with, we can talk to it, we can touch it, we can smell it, we can feel it. It's real. That's what Jesus has done to the law, is he's put life to it. He showed us that this is what we were supposed to be experiencing all along with the law. And so then we see that Jesus would likely be hit with another question. Somebody says, okay, so Jesus, you're saying that you're here to honor God's will revealed in the Torah. To which Jesus says in Matthew 5:19, he says, listen, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So back when I was still living at home with my parents, teenager at this point, learning some new responsibilities, getting more chores, trying to figure out how in the world to be a human being, because that's what teenagers have to do. I remember one year in particular that my dad decided that this year I was going to help to hang up the Christmas lights. I was going to get some more responsibility. I was hanging up the Christmas lights, and I don't blame him, because now as a dad, I don't want to hang up the Christmas lights, right? So I get it. So we both went out into the front yard. He got the ladder out. He showed me how to put the ladder on the house in a way that it's not going to tip over and fall, that I'm not going to kill myself, anything like that. All things that parents should do for their teenage children, right? And he shows me how to use the staple gun, because once again, teenagers are, for some reason, we're like, staple gun, perfect. And who knows what's going to happen, right? And so he walks me through all of that stuff, but he also decided that he would show me one of his life hacks to make the job a little bit faster than it otherwise would be. Now, if you're not familiar, usually sometimes a life hack is just a good tip, but oftentimes what I've found is that a life hack is somebody's figured out how to ignore certain parts of the instructions to get to the end a little bit faster, and that's their life hack. And so normally, when you hang up Christmas lights, you run the risk of you get all the lights on, you plug them in, and there's a whole section that's out, right? Anybody ever lived that reality? And now you got to figure out what in the world's going on. And here's the problem. You can take all the lights out of the box, lay them all out on the ground, plug them in, they all work, unplug them, hang them up, and now you've got a section out. And it's like, I checked this. Why are they not working? And so my dad said, I've got a fix for that. You plug them in, and you hang them while they're plugged in. You just staple through as you go and just don't hit the wire, right? Which is great in theory, but for me, it was not so great in practice, because I did hit the wire. And what I remember is being on the ladder, hitting the staple gun. I think that I screamed. I don't entirely remember. And all of a sudden, I was looking at the sky. And that's where I was. I got really familiar with 120 volts that day, which actually isn't that bad. It's worse your first time, but it gets better, which tells you how well I learned my lessons. But now here's the thing. I am no expert on Christmas light instructions, right? I've not pulled out the instructions from the box of Christmas lights and diligently read through them. And I'd be willing to bet that you haven't either. But here's the thing. The fact that my printer ink has instructions not to eat it, I am certain that there is somewhere in the Christmas lights instructions that says do not staple through these while they're plugged in. Like there's got to be something there. But that was my dad's life hack. And Jesus is coming on and he's telling us, he's like, listen, I recognize there are people who think they have found the life hack to the law. They think that there's things that they can skip, things they can get around, things that you can reorder, some things aren't really necessary at this point anymore. And Jesus is telling us that's not okay. That's not the way the law works. You don't get a life hack your way into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus actually tells us, he tells us that the people who have these life hacks, who skip around, who do whatever they're doing, that it's not something that keeps them out of the kingdom of heaven, but it is something that makes them least in the kingdom of heaven. So then what about the greatest? What about them? That's reserved for those who both teach and practice all of the law. Last week, I briefly mentioned how so much of the church in America has a damaged reputation right now. And it's interesting because there are so many of us who are being faithful and living out our Christianity in honest and reputable ways. Like if you think about the Christians that you know in your life, I bet you would be able to point to more people who you can say they get it. And they are following Jesus like they truly love him and are for him. And there would be fewer people who you could point at and say they don't get it. They're just here for their own agenda. Right? There's more people who are faithfully living it out, and yet who does the world see? They see the hypocrites. Not to say that we're all not, but it's the ones who have some sort of agenda behind it. My kids are constantly asking me, why do I get to do things that they don't get to do? Right? And sometimes there's a good reason. Oftentimes there's a good reason. Sometimes there's not. Right? Like sometimes it's just like, dude, frankly, I just need 5 minutes to not hear anything. I forgot what silence sounds like. I forgot what it's like to be in a room with no other people in it. I forgot what it's like to remember what my skin feels like when nobody's touching it. Like, I just need a minute, okay? And that's why you can't do this thing with me, okay? So sometimes there's a good reason, sometimes there's not. But here's the thing. If my kids are noticing that I will say things or I will do things that they cannot say or do, if they're noticing that, then it stands to reason that if there are those in the church who are treating the law as a bunch of do's and don'ts, and then not even following those do's and don'ts on their own, that the world's going to see it. And quite frankly, why would they want to be a part of something like that? If that's the way that we're painting Jesus to the world, why would they want to hitch their wagon to him? And so here's what Jesus is doing. And here's why we have to go through the whole Sermon on the Mount and not just pick out little portions of it, right? Because Jesus pulls from what we've already looked at in the Sermon on the Mount. He's constantly grabbing onto those things. And so unless you go through the whole thing, you miss these things. What Jesus is doing is Jesus is teaching us how to lead and how to live out the law with a pure heart. Remember, that was one of the last things that Jesus said in the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. And Jesus says that the kingdom is here now. It's not fully realized, but it has touched down. And this means that there are people who are partnering with Jesus in his vision for the kingdom being on earth as it is in heaven. And these are people who are living their lives out of a pure heart. And a pure heart is just somebody who is totally the same person on the inside as they are on the out. Somebody who is through and through authentic. And it's the person who's not teaching you the rules begrudgingly. It's not the person who's teaching you the rules that they don't plan to follow. It's the person who's excited to show you how to follow the rules like them. In fact, I would say that the person who's truly living this out through a pure heart is the person who's not even thinking of this as rules. It's the person who is compelled that God has cast this vision of this life, of this relationship with him, and sees that he gave the law as a means of showing us a better way to live, and that this person is simply excited to step into that kind of life. This person's just excited to be a part of that. So I've started doing this crazy thing recently, and no one here is allowed to judge me for it, okay? Okay? Gosh, you guys are sketchy. So I've started doing this crazy thing where when I drive, which is not often, but when I drive, I actually drive the speed limit. Like, I set my cruise control so I'm not even going a single mile an hour over the speed limit, okay? Which I know is insane because nobody does that. And I'm pretty sure that when I took my driving test, I didn't even do that. I was like 5 to 7 miles an hour over the speed limit in my entire driving test. And the instructor's just like, yeah, that checks out. We're in California. That's what everybody does. Nothing I can do about it, right? This is how we live our lives. And I want to say this, that there is nothing in this that makes me feel like a better person about any of this, because in fact, what I've realized is that so many more people are frustrated with me and annoyed with me because they're trying to go 90 miles an hour down Claws, and I'm like, it's 50 miles an hour, guys. And I'm just cruising. And I'm like, It feels like it's kind of slow, but, it's just what it is. You go, yeah, we don't have to get into more of it. But here's the thing. What changed in me? Okay, and again, I want to make this very clear, and I'll break this down more, that I'm not saying any of this out of arrogance. What changed is that God has compelled me that there is a better way to live my life. I don't need to rush anywhere. I'm still intentional about being on time. In fact, I have to be far more intentional about my time. But for the record, I've also found that speeding doesn't actually get me anywhere any faster. So I'm just throwing that out there for whatever you guys want to do with it. But here's the reason why this all matters, okay? I'll be honest with you guys for a second. I have found in my life that I am addicted to work. I am terrified of being called lazy. And so I feel like I have to perform. The world says you've got to hustle, you've got to grind. And I'm saying, okay, I will do it, and I'll do it better than anybody else, because the thing at the end of the day that I'm terrified of is being worthless. And I feel like some of you can resonate with that. And I feel like if I'm lazy, then I'm worthless. And so here's what's happening is it's almost as if Jesus is partnering with the law, like literally the law, to wrap his arms around me and tell me that even when I'm not busy, I am still deeply valuable and deeply loved. This is what Jesus does with the law. And it's almost as if now Jesus is pulling me aside again and saying, okay, Seth, now there's another step. What if you were to approach total obedience to me in this way? What if total obedience to Jesus meant a better way to live our lives? Meant more security in who we are? Meant ultimately more life to the life that we're living? That's what it means to truly teach and truly practice every teeny tiny law. And then it's as if Jesus is finally asked. The person says, okay, so Jesus, you're telling us how to follow God's will in the Torah. I get that, but I can go down the road to the Pharisees or the Torah teachers, and they can tell me that too. So Jesus says in Matthew 5:20, he says, listen, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, here's the problem in our modern context, okay? We love stories, right? We love stories. Like everything about our lives is wrapped around stories. We like to go see a movie. What makes a movie good? The story. What makes a book good? The story. What makes a video game good? The story. What makes a friend good? They have the best stories, right? We love stories. But there is a fundamental truth about stories. Every good story has a good guy and a bad guy, right? Every good story has a good guy and a bad guy. And our problem is that because we've already read forward in the story, we've already seen how Jesus responds to the Pharisees, we've built out in our minds, that's the bad guy. We've figured it out, the Pharisees are the bad guy, which is interesting because may I remind you that the Apostle Paul says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. There is no person who is our enemy. There are no people who are our enemy. Our enemies are spiritual entities. And so we miss just how shocking this statement from Jesus truly would have been. Because here's the thing. Nobody cared more about Torah obedience than the Pharisees. No one. The Pharisees were on this. They wanted to be obedient. They wanted to follow the law of God. And yet Jesus is telling us that we have to do better. The Torah is all about righteousness. So if anyone is righteous, it must be those guys. It must be the Pharisees. And Jesus tells us that our righteousness has to exceed theirs. That should be terrifying, church. That should be terrifying. Because here's the thing. Jesus mentions the teachers of the law. These would have been like the scribes, okay? In our context today, these are the certified Bible nerds, okay? These are the guys who are nerding out over the ancient texts. They're sitting in their rooms together, and they're reading through the Hebrew scriptures in the Hebrew, translating it into their language, writing the commentaries. And today, these may be the guys who are authoring your favorite books that have shaped your Christianity, okay? And then Jesus mentions the Pharisees. And there's really no good one-to-one for the Pharisees in our modern context. There's no one person who does all the same things. But some of the things that Jesus gets on, see, we think of the Pharisees and we think of them as like these zealots for the law who want to make following God hard for the sake of their own power. But that's not really it. The Pharisees were these people who taught others how to apply the Bible in their daily lives, and they had some sway in the culture as well. It's almost like pastors in the Bible Belt, right? They every day, they're teaching, every week, they're teaching how to apply the Bible in their lives, but these guys actually have some sway in the culture too. They've got some respect in the culture. People look to them. And so the people would have been shocked by what Jesus is saying, because these are certainly not the bad guys. And so we have to try to reorient our thinking a little bit to see what Jesus was really saying. If our righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees, then I guess nobody gets into the kingdom of heaven. That's what it sounds like. That would have been the overwhelming feeling. And what we fail to realize is we call out the Pharisees for being too strict on the law. Church, Jesus was more strict than they were. He was far more strict than they were. At first, people were looking at this guy, Jesus, and they're like, he's too loose with the law. But here's what happens. The rest of the weeks going up from now to Easter, we're going to be looking at passages where Jesus says, you've heard it said this, but I say unto you this. And what he's doing is he's saying, you thought the bar was here? Oh, this bar is so much harder to reach than you thought it was. There was so much more that I had in mind than you thought. This is far more strict than we ever thought. And so what this means is that Jesus, while he is calling us to this, he says, be holy as I'm holy. He calls us to be perfect as he is. And we know that that's impossible. We know that every single one of us in here is broken. What we realize is the righteousness that Jesus is calling us to. He's not just saying there's an impossible level of righteousness that the Pharisees hold, and so all of you are out. You're just, sorry, you're not good enough for the kingdom of heaven. What it actually means is that he's calling us to a different type of righteousness. Jesus' disciples are called to a different kind and a different quality of righteousness. It's not about the degree of righteousness, but it's about fundamentally reshaping the how of righteousness. Here's what Clinton Arnold wrote about the way that the Pharisees understood the law and how they pursued righteousness. He says, quote, the rabbis recognized a distinction between light and weighty Old Testament commandments and advocated obedience to both. Light commandments were those such as the requirement to tithe on produce, like in Leviticus 27:30 or Deuteronomy 14:22. While weighty commandments are those such as profaning the name of God or the Sabbath or matters of social justice, as in Exodus 20:2-8 or Micah 6:8, unquote. So in other words, they would categorize the laws into there's the big laws and there's the little laws. And we follow all of them. So we must be pretty great, right? And there are people in the society that are like, we'll follow the big laws, but the little laws, they're little laws. And so then when Jesus says that your righteousness has to beat the Pharisees, it kind of feels like, uh-oh. It kind of feels like, oh no. But then what Jesus does is Jesus is now saying, you've missed it. The Old Testament laws, the Old Testament commandments are not about these weighty laws and these light laws. The whole of the law is actually about love. It's all about love. And it's using love as a catapult to move humanity, to launch humanity and all of creation forward into the vision that God has always had for his creation. It's not about these big and little laws and trying to figure out the do's and don'ts. It's about allowing God to transform you into a being of love like he himself is. And Jesus came as the ultimate picture of love. He is the fullness of the love of God in human flesh. And he lived out a perfect life of love. And it was for that reason that he was able to die on the cross in your place, because he did fulfill the law. He filled it full. His love was everything that the law was pointing to. It was everything that the law desired. And that's why he was able to die in your place. So that ultimately, you could receive his righteousness. And that is how your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees. And this righteousness translates to being in right relationship with others. And we recognize that there's nuance to these right relationships, right? A good relationship with my wife is different than a good relationship with my coworkers. Like, we fundamentally understand that. And so if that's the case, then a right relationship with the supreme God of creation must look different. There's something different about it. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 20 and 21. Paul says, "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, and as though God were making his appeal through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Maybe you're here today because you're just checking Christianity out. You're unsure about this Jesus, and you've only heard of Christianity as a bunch of rules to follow rather than a better life to live. I want you to know that Jesus has seen you exactly as you are. The good, the bad, everything. He's seen you exactly as you are. And he thought you were worth taking the cross for you, to die on your behalf, so that you might take his righteousness on your behalf, so that you could be in right relationship with God himself. So if that's you, I want you to know that today's your opportunity. Today's your invitation. I'm going to be available up here at the end of services if you'd like to pray, if you'd like to ask questions, if you just need somebody to vent to because of the things in your life. I'm available for you. But for all of us, Paul wrote first that we are Christ's ambassadors. We go out on his behalf to be people of righteousness and to see righteousness in the world. And so here are our takeaways for this week. Number one, live with integrity. Avoid hypocrisy by ensuring that your outward actions align with the faith that you profess, ultimately so that others can see Christ in you. Avoid hypocrisy. Number two, avoid legalism and license. Don't fall into either extreme, being overly rigid with rules or treating God's commands as just something that's optional in your life. Instead, look at Jesus' way of obedience through love. Figure out how you can find yourself being obedient to Jesus through the lens of love. And number three, be an ambassador this week. Like, actually do something to be an ambassador this week, whether it's showing kindness to a neighbor, whether it's serving somebody in need, or whether it's just speaking words of hope to somebody who's struggling. Find a way to be an ambassador this week. So live with integrity, avoid legalism and avoid license, and be an ambassador this week. Let's pray. God, we just want to thank you first and foremost for your son Jesus, for his fulfillment of the law, that he was able to perfectly embody everything that you could have hoped to have seen as a result of your law. And because of that, Jesus, we thank you that we can be in perfect relationship with you, with the Father, with the Spirit. And we ask that you would overwhelm us today, that you would transform our hearts from the inside out, so that we are people of obedience, not because of rigidity to the law, but because of people who are overwhelmed with love for you and for your kingdom. Would you compel us to move forward? Would you cast a vision for us of your kingdom that is so enticing that we feel we have no other option but to pursue you boldly and with everything that we have? And so we give our lives to you this morning, Jesus, and we simply ask, use us. It's in your perfect name that we pray, Jesus. Amen.